Elon Musk and Donald Trump's friendship might have a ticking time bomb, and it's called DOGE.
The economy, I believe, is going to be very strong. We do have to solve some problems.
The second Trump era is here, and while the star might be the same, a lot of the supporting characters are different this time, and the most notable of them is Elon Musk. If somehow you don't know, Musk is an incredibly influential businessman who's had big roles at companies like Tesla and SpaceX, and is now the richest person in the world.
Now, a lot of the conversation about Musk tends to zigzag between people on the left who hate him automatically and people on the right who defend him reflexively. I'm not really interested in doing either of those.
And while Musk is a super interesting figure on his own, traveling from an Obama to Clinton to Biden voter, to skeptical of Trump, to vocal backer of Trump, to member of Trump's inner circle,
the basic idea of a super rich donor and buddy being around a politician and influencing them from the outside isn't completely unique. That's happened a lot of times throughout history with presidents of both parties. But what is really unique is the role that Musk is already directly playing in policymaking. And that will probably only get bigger with the Department of Government Efficiency.
Despite the name, this is not actually a new federal department. Creating one of those requires Congress to pass a new law and fund it, which so far it has not done. It was named this for the acronym DOGE, which, if you are under 30 years old or not addicted to the internet, is a reference to a millennial meme from the Obama administration and the crypto coin named after it. But even if the name is a bit of a joke, the work it's proposing is super serious. The commission will focus on executing big spending cuts. Musk and his co-leader, Vivek Ramaswamy, have said that they want to cut up to $2 trillion in spending. And there's already a lot of support from people across the ideological spectrum, many of whom are expressing concern at the enormous federal debt and deficit, which are both currently huge. But what DOGE actually does and what it recommends could go a million different ways. And one direction in particular could soon pit Trump and Musk directly against each other. To understand why, let's start off by defining some terms. The federal deficit is purely annual. It's how much the government spent in a given year versus how much it took in. Having more money than you spent is called a surplus. Having less money is called a deficit. Right now, the deficit is $1.8 trillion. The federal debt, which right now is $36 trillion, is collective. It's every deficit piled on top of each other throughout the 250-year history of the country, plus interest. And that distinction is really important, given how much politicians often conflate the two. Trump, for example, promised back in 2016 to eliminate the federal debt in 8 years. That is quite literally impossible. Even if the government basically eliminated itself and spent $0, there just would not be enough revenue to do that. In order to even begin actually reducing the national debt, the country would need to begin posting big surpluses year after year after year. And basically no one in either party these days has any plan to get to that point. Trump very likely meant eliminating the deficit, which he also didn't do. It went up every year he was in office, and has stayed super high under Biden. But it wasn't that long ago that the country had basically eliminated the deficit. In the 1990s, a combination of tax increases, strong economic growth, and spending cuts drastically reduced the federal deficit. Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich, who were the leaders of their parties during the 90s, have always bragged about creating surpluses. But that's not exactly true. They actually used some budget gimmicks to make it look like a surplus, but the country still technically spent more than it took in. The reason for the disconnect is because they borrowed from funds the government is legally obligated to refill no matter what, like the Social Security Trust Fund. But still, they were close enough to a surplus that they could use gimmicks to look like they had one, which no one has even come close to since. So what would it take for DOGE, or anyone, to actually get us to a surplus? Well, that's where it's really worth looking at what is actually in the federal budget. Take fiscal year 2024, the most recent. The federal government took in $4.9 trillion in revenue and spent $6.7 trillion, creating a deficit of $1.8 trillion. Right off the bat, $950 billion of that spending, or 14%, was interest on the national debt, which we have to pay if we want to be a functioning and reliable country and not crash the economy. So that's not even a choice. Of the remaining $5.8 trillion of non-interest federal spending, $4.2 trillion, or 72%, is what's called mandatory spending, meaning it is on autopilot to be spent no matter what, like the Social Security Trust Fund we just talked about. Congress could meet 0 days a year, pass no new laws, and that money is going out regardless. Most of this money is in the programs that are called the Big Three: Medicare, which provides health insurance to Americans over 65, Social Security, which provides retirement to Americans over 65, and Medicaid, which provides healthcare to poor, working class, and disabled Americans. Other programs in this mandatory bucket include veterans benefits, retirement accounts for the military and federal workers, food stamps, and unemployment insurance. These programs are sometimes referred to as entitlements, not because of a boomer sense of like entitled people, but because if you qualify for them, like if you're over 65, or if you're a veteran, or if you make under a certain amount of money, you are legally entitled to the benefits no matter what. And again, this money is mandatory. It legally has to go out if you qualify for it, and is set up to go out no matter what Congress does. The 27% or so of non-interest spending that is not mandatory is called discretionary spending, which is split into two categories. The first, defense spending, is the military, and that accounts for $849 billion, or almost 15% of total non-interest federal spending. That's weapons, planes, helicopters, guns, bombs, military salaries, defense contractors, all of that. The second category is called non-defense discretionary spending, which is $948 billion, or almost 17% of non-interest spending. This category is everything else. Education spending, transportation funding for bridges and trains, police funding, veterans medical care, grants for scientific research. This is where the overwhelming majority of the things Musk and Ramaswamy have talked about cutting come from. And this is also where the spending you might have seen in memes or viral posts comes in. Studies of shrimp walking on treadmills or octopuses being given MDMA. Now, first off, it's worth noting that the actual purpose of these programs is often not captured by these viral posts. The study about shrimp on treadmills, for example, was one part of a bigger study to find out which types of pollution impacted crustaceans and how much. A question that actually has huge ramifications for public health, the biodiversity of the ocean, and the regions of the country that depend on things like fishing. It might sound really silly to fund a study about giving octopuses MDMA, but the results of that study have actually helped inform the usage of MDMA to treat previously untreatable PTSD, including veterans traumatized by war. Now, you can still think that that's not worth taxpayer funding, but it's objectively true that the picture is a lot more complex than just bureaucrats shooting a money gun at wasteful academics. And it's worth emphasizing the impact that federally funded academic, medical, and scientific research can have. The GPS, touchscreen phones, the internet itself. These are all programs that exist in large part because of federal funding. Apple got early taxpayer-funded financing from the Small Business Association. Google owes its algorithm largely to federally funded research. The two biggest medical breakthroughs in recent history, the COVID vaccine and Ozempic, both came about as a result of massive federal funding. Now again, you can philosophically disagree with all of this. You can think that companies should survive on their own. You can think that some of the things produced by federal aid, from the COVID vaccine to smartphones, are bad. But as you see news articles or people trying to go viral, it's worth remembering that one detail sounding silly or wasteful is different than actually being silly or wasteful. But beyond whatever you think about these projects, the bigger reason it's worth talking about this section is because of how small a portion of the federal budget these are. Take, for example, the two pots of foreign aid that people on both the left and the right have had big issues with recently. All of the military assistance that the US has sent to Ukraine since Russia's invasion adds up to 3.3% of the 2024 deficit and 0.16% of the debt. All of the aid the US has sent to Israel since the attack on October 7th adds up to 1% of the 2024 deficit and 0.05% of the debt. You can eliminate all non-defense discretionary spending, not just the viral programs or studies, but thousands of programs that millions of people and whole regions of the country rely on, and you still would be left with a higher budget deficit than every single year in history before 2009. Again, if you think these programs are inherently immoral or wasteful, it doesn't matter their relative size. If I'm paying 50 cents for a subscription I don't use, I still want to cancel it. But if your goal is reducing the deficit, or eliminating the deficit, or getting a surplus, or reducing the national debt, you just simply mathematically cannot do that through these programs, especially because of one core fact: the long-term trajectory of entitlement or mandatory spending. Look at this chart. Overwhelmingly, the category of federal spending that has exploded over the past couple decades and that will continue to grow in the future comes from one place: mandatory spending, those entitlement programs we talked about. So whether you're a conservative, liberal, moderate, libertarian, leftist, whatever, There's just no debate here. If you actually want to cut spending, or cut the deficit, or create a surplus, or bring down the debt, you have to figure out what to do with entitlement programs. There have been some progressive ideas, like eliminating the cap on income that can be taxed to fund Social Security. There are some conservative ideas, like turning Medicare into a voucher program. But on their own, they don't even come close to reducing the long-term explosion, let alone completely solving the problem. Even huge tax increases, bigger than anything Democrats even support, wouldn't be enough. And all of that becomes really important because support for these programs is one of the most crucial parts of Donald Trump's political brand. For all of the focus on immigration or trade or his foreign policy, one of the most notable things about Donald Trump's campaigns, beginning back in 2015, was how he broke with other Republicans on programs like Social Security and Medicare. We talked about this in our last episode, go check it out. But you really have to understand that for a long time, Republicans ran explicitly on big changes or cuts to these programs, especially when Obama was president. The Tea Party had come along in 2009 and 2010, protesting Obamacare, government spending, and the president himself. And almost all Republicans interpreted that as grassroots support for slashing Social Security and Medicare, even though polls showed that that was super unpopular. Congressional Republicans rolled out plans to make enormous cuts to these programs. Mitt Romney ran on those plans in 2012, and after he lost, Republicans had a big conversation about the need to change their immigration and cultural positions, but no conversation about changing their positions on cutting the social safety net. Then Trump came along and blew all of that up. And a ton of studies and polls have shown that his decision to break with other Republicans on cutting entitlement programs has been an enormous political strength for him, just as much as anything about race or immigration. Now, the funny thing is, every one of his budgets as president the first time did actually propose cutting those programs, by a lot. And while he absolutely bears responsibility for that, he was president and those were his budgets, it's also true that that mostly happened because of Trump appointing the kinds of people that everyone agrees won't be there this time, the traditional DC-dwelling guardrail conservatives. This time, while he's promised to follow his own compass, there's also DOGE, and its task of making the government spend less money really is very difficult if you don't involve the entitlements Trump swore not to touch. Already, Musk, Ramaswamy, and some Republicans in Congress are talking about tinkering with them.
If you talk about 75% of the budget, 75% is non-discretionary. Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, there's hundreds of billions of dollars to be saved, and we know how to do it. We just have to have the stomach to actually take those challenges on.
Which sets up a question that will have enormous implications, not just for Trump and Musk's new friendship, but for the country itself. The billionaires or the base. It's a new year, it's a new president, it's a new era in politics. And whether you're thrilled or worried, there's a lot to learn and a lot to know about. So hit that subscribe button and that bell so you know every time we post a video.